Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the RWA Coffee Chat. This morning, we are really pleased to have Congressman Ami Bera here with us. A little bit of an introduction first. Congressman Bera represents nearly 800,000 people in California's 7th Congressional District. Congressman Bera is currently a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he serves as chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and non-proliferation. He also is a senior member of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. You can learn more about Congressman Bera's impressive background in public service and legislative priorities at bera.house.gov/about. So with that, thank you, Congressman Bera, today for joining us on water. But before we get too far, I want to thank you for your efforts on the Afghanistan situation on behalf of the RWA. That's really a challenging situation right now. We know that you and your office have been involved quite a bit on that. And we're also fortunate that you are a physician working on the COVID-19 pandemic and those things. Before we also get too far, I want to make some reminders to our audience members. And that is this is being recorded right now. We have a few questions that were submitted earlier in the week for Congressman Bera we're going to ask. But feel free to submit some questions if we're running out of those questions, going to the Q&A button below. And we will answer questions if time allows. And with that, Congressman Bera, I'd like you to get started and sort of frame this up for us in terms of some general thoughts before we get to the questions.
Well, great. Jim, thanks for that generous introduction. And, obviously we saw the tragic events in Afghanistan yesterday and with the loss of life, both of, the men and women that are serving our country, but also the loss of Afghani lives that directly impact our community here in Sacramento. So, our thoughts and prayers are with our troops, but also with the folks in Afghanistan that are trying to get out and get to safety. And again, thanks for mentioning the hard work that my district staff and actually the entire team is doing to, again, try to get people safely out of the country. Because, we've got the largest Afghan refugee population in Sacramento County for the entire nation. So it's a very rich, culturally important population in our community. So let's shift and talk about water. I'm certainly happy to take questions about what's happening in Afghanistan, but also about the pandemic as well. But we're here to talk water a little bit. And I think there are a couple, you saw us legislating earlier this week in Washington, D.C. to really move forward on two big pieces of legislation. One is the bipartisan infrastructure deal, which now we've negotiated, will come up for a vote by the end of September. That bill is hugely important, not just to the country, but also to our region, because it'll have hard infrastructure needs in there, roads, bridges, highways, but also water infrastructure and water resiliency, especially given the challenge that we're seeing here on an annual basis now with worsening droughts. Obviously, we're living through a really dry year and a drought-like situation right now, but also with the wildfires, et cetera. So, I think these projects are hugely important, not just for our country, but certainly for our region. Improving water storage, creating better and more efficient water systems, replacing old water infrastructure, old pipes that are leaky, et cetera. So I'm very confident that we will get that infrastructure deal across the finish line. Again, and that bill's already written. It's passed the Senate, and it should come up for a vote in the House, again, by the end of September. The second piece, you'll hear people talk about budget reconciliation. That's a bill that still is being written. We took a process vote earlier this week, which allows the committees of jurisdiction to write those bills. That bill also is going to have impact because the Build Back Better Act, which is the name of that bill, addresses the human infrastructure needs. So, it'll lead to job creation, it'll address the cost of healthcare and certainly address hopefully prescription drug prices and things that are bread and butter issues to families. It hopefully will address access to higher education, community college education, but also on the front end, making investments in universal pre-K and so forth. I don't know what that final bill will look like. You'll hear the term $3.5 trillion. I don't think that'll be the final number after all the negotiations take place, because you do have to put a bill together that will pass both the House and Senate. And with narrow majorities, there's still a long ways to go on that bill, but I suspect we will still, both of these bills will pass. In addition, we've also been able to get some community sponsored project funding. I was up in Citrus Heights a couple of weeks ago visiting a project that we were able to pass out of the House to do groundwater recharge and again create better storage capacity in our aquifers and so forth. I think those are the types of projects that are vital to our community and district as we think about how we better manage water, how we better when it rains, capture that water, store that water, and make sure we have it there when we need it. So I'm going to stop with those kind of opening comments, and really would love to hear the questions that folks have, and would open it up to a conversation.
Thank you, Congressman. Real quick though, we had a question from Evan Jacobs from California American Water, and he was really interested in understanding what resources are available to help people help with Afghani Americans. And we have included the response from your office in the chat. I'm going to go to a question submitted by Tony Forenzi from Placer County Water Agency. And that is, thank you, Representative Bera, for your advocacy on solutions to climate change, in particular, the water bank. Can you summarize federal priorities for Western water as they relate to our efforts in the American River watershed?
Yeah, I think a couple things that we've really pushed for. I talked a little bit about increasing our storage capacity with the aquifer and groundwater recharge. I think we're blessed with water agencies that work very closely together, creating the water bank and so forth. I also, since getting elected to Congress, have been a real advocate for moving the Scythe Reservoir project forward. I think that's hugely important. And the reason why I think it matters to my district and to Sacramento County is if we did get sites completed from a water storage perspective, it would take a lot of pressure off of Folsom Lake and Folsom Reservoir. And that obviously is a large source of surface water for consumers in Sacramento County. So those, from a federal level, I'd like to see us continue moving forward on the Scythe Reservoir project. And again, if we get this infrastructure bill done, I really do think, big fan of groundwater recharge, groundwater storage, and I think that's hugely important to our district.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm going to ask a question from Miss Ann Sanger from the city of Sacramento. This year's hydrology obviously didn't turn out the way we had hoped. And in fact, the American River watershed had a fairly good snowpack going into the spring. Between the months of April and May, however, the snow did not turn into inflow at Folsom Reservoir. As a member of the Science Committee, is there anything that you will be looking into with regard to how we can better predict inflow to Folsom Reservoir? The committee oversees the work of the National Science Foundation. Do any of the research in the areas of hydrology and soils help?
And that's a very technical question. I do think a couple things. We have to work with NOAA and other agencies to better forecast and have a longer time horizon to forecast what precipitation is going to look like. And rightfully pointed out that our water systems right now are built on having a robust snowpack up in the Sierra Nevadas, and as we get into the spring and summer, that snow slowly melts off. Unfortunately, what we've seen in recent years is more precipitations coming down as rain as opposed to snow, or the snow that does come down is melting off much faster. We also, as I think Ann rightfully pointed out, had you asked me back in February or March, there was a lot of snow up in the mountains, when we go up to Lake Tahoe and other places. But unfortunately, as that snow started melting off, it was also absorbed into the soil. So the runoff that we would have expected, coming out of that snowpack wasn't nearly as robust as, we may have predicted. So I think we do need better forecasting. I think, with the joint federal project up at Folsom Dam, we have more flexibility where you can hold more water back as opposed to some of the forced runoffs. And I think we've got to continue to think through what that flexibility looks like, because while it seems silly for us to be talking about the flood risk in the region, Sacramento County historically, or our region, has had one of the highest flood risks. So we've got this dual threat now of real dry years, but also we've experienced some real wet years where we have seen flooding. So I think it's a little bit of all of that. And I do think making those investments in better understanding climate science, better understanding soil science, and thinking through how in this new paradigm where we don't have that robust snowpack, we can think through different ways of managing water. And again, I think that's where I'm going to sound like a tired record, but I do think that's where aquifer recharge and groundwater recharge is going to be a real big component of what we do now, especially if that precipitation is coming down as rain as opposed to snow.
Thank you, Congressman Bera. We're going to skip to a couple questions that are coming in from the audience. We have one from Mr. Tim Murphy. Has there been any discussion of putting federal monies towards expanding desalination tech?
There has been, and you've seen some projects in Southern California and other parts. Obviously that impacts us less up here, but if you have those desalination projects down there, and if you improve the technology and the efficiency and the cost, that is another source of water, especially if we're going to see sea level rise, et cetera. And I think that is certainly a worthy area of both investing in the research to improve efficiency and lower costs, but also as we look at more precious water sources. That technology is also going to be really important when we think globally. If you look at the number of people that are going to be displaced by lack of water and lack of food, in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts, as we see the planet warming, access to other sources of water is going to be hugely important.
Thank you, Congressman. Let me ask another audience question, or ask an audience question. This one is related to wildfire, and it is from Mr. Andrew Fecco. Congressman Bera, thank you for your efforts on behalf of the Sacramento region. Are your colleagues in Congress focused on the Western wildfire crisis, and do they think, or do they recognize the scope and scale of the investment that is necessary to keep our forest sustainable while we work to solve the climate crisis?
I think they increasingly are. Obviously, we've had to live with devastating fires now going back on the last 5-6 years on an annual basis. Certainly on the West Coast, we in Oregon and Washington State, they've been living through it. But now, as you see fires in Minnesota and other parts, I think people are realizing the real impact of it. And I've seen just in my short time in Congress, where my first couple terms, there really was a fight about acknowledging that that climate was changing, the planet was getting warmer. We don't seem to be having those fights any longer. It's more about what are the solutions going to be. I also think there's a place where Democrats and Republicans could work more closely together, particularly on federal lands, on how we better manage our forests, how we potentially thin our forests a little bit. And historically, the problem was the money that we would set aside for forest management was all consumed to fight the fires. And so we've solved this issue of fire borrowing, which is the term that we use in Congress, where you take those forest management funds and when it came time to manage the forest, those dollars weren't there any longer. I think we've got to dedicate more resources to more actively manage and mitigate fire risk. And then I do think there'll be, as our population's grown here in California, certainly in Northern California, there will be a debate of where folks are building homes and residents and the like. But I think we have to learn how to live with these fires. We have to dedicate more resources to mitigating the fires and fire preparation. And unfortunately, it looks like fire season right now is year-round.
Thank you, Congressman. We have another question from the audience. Do you see earmarks continuing in fiscal year 23?
Yeah, so I'd call them congressionally directed project funding. But I actually think it's a good thing because my job as a member of Congress is to advocate for those projects and priorities for my district, and as opposed to just leave it up to the president to decide which projects they want to fund and not fund. So I think a very transparent process, which is what we set up in our office, where groups, cities, nonprofits could submit their ideas and their rationale for why those projects should receive funds. We went through a very thoughtful process. I learned a lot about projects that I wasn't even aware of in our district. And then having the ability to go to the various committees, in this case, the Appropriations Committee, and advocate and submit the projects that we thought would be the most relevant to our districts. I think it's a good process, and I think it's a very transparent process. And I think at its core, that's what our job is to advocate for resources and prioritize the projects in our district. And I don't know if we lost Jim.
This is Kathy, event staff. We actually did lose Jim, so I think he just launched back in.
Oh, Jim, you're on mute.
Hi, Congressman, I'm back. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Internet problems. Okay, so we have a couple more questions that have come in, and I'd like to, well, first, I want to make a comment from Marcus Yasutaki, who is the Utilities Director at the City of Folsom. He thanks you for your past and continued support on water supply reliability projects that not only benefit the City of Folsom, but provide regional benefits. The support also carries over into the city's public safety and transportation responsibilities. I'm going to ask a question from Mr. Audie Foster. Congressman Bera, as groundwater recharge becomes an important part of a water management portfolio, what help do you see coming to protect newly stored water from emerging contaminants like PFOAs?
Yeah, so the PFAS issue is a major issue, not just in our community, but across this country. So we've got to continue to dedicate resources to cleaning up some of the PFAS contaminants. And then, obviously, another big issue that I'm very aware of and working on is, as you kind of see the Lockheed Martin Aerojet merger taking place, we've still got a big Superfund site at the old Aerojet, and still we'll have years of cleanup of our groundwater to make it usable. So very consciously paying attention to that merger and making sure if merger goes through, that Lockheed Martin continues to fulfill the obligations that Aerojet has. And again, I'm told, and I've talked to the EPA and talked to the executive of Lockheed Martin, that they very much intend to do that. I just want to make sure that we don't find ourselves 5 years from now having a big groundwater issue on our hands. But on the PFAS issue, Congress is very aware of it. And again, I think in a bipartisan way, we'll continue to dedicate funding to clean up some of the contaminants from PFAS.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one or two more questions, and then we would like to give you some time before your hard stop at 11:25. The question coming in from Mr. Tony Ferenzi is, one of the assets of the Sacramento region is local agriculture in the Sacramento Valley. Do you believe sustainability of agriculture for the long term of our region is being addressed in federal policy?
I think it's starting to address probably more quickly in state policy, but agriculture is just a huge part of California's economy, and certainly people don't always think about Sacramento County as an agricultural community, but if you go to the eastern part of the county, we do have a lot of farms and agriculture there. Again, I think the challenge we have in California is historically we've had an abundance of water, so you built up systems expecting that there was an unlimited amount of water. That's not the case any longer. So I think you're seeing the ag communities, the farming communities start to use better technology to better manage their farms, drip systems, et cetera, to better manage a more limited commodity water in this case. You've also seen, obviously, in the Central Valley, a depletion of the groundwater in that area. So, I think there is an urgency to invest in the R&D to better manage water on farms. I think that the agricultural community is certainly moving in that direction. We're blessed to have UC Davis in our region, the top ag school in my mind in the world. And then, we're also working with partners around the world. Israel has some of the most advanced water management systems in the world, obviously because it's a very arid place that doesn't have access to a lot of fresh water. So learning from partners like that and taking some of those lessons and starting to incorporate those on our farms, I think is hugely important.
Thank you, Congressman. Comment from Dane Wadley. Thank you for your support and co-sponsorship on the Special Districts Provide Essential Services Act of 2020 and 2021. Here's another question from the audience. Can you comment on the Buy American provision in the infrastructure bill? The water sector has expressed a lot of concern about the increasing cost of projects and slowing down of the timeline, waiting for American manufacturing to catch up. And that'll probably be our last question, so we can send you on your way.
Yeah, so I think the devil will be in the details on how that provision gets implemented. I certainly understand the desire for us to start onshoring things and rebuilding American manufacturing and taking taxpayer dollars and investing those in rebuilding our own manufacturing sector. That said, I don't think it should be either or, because again, it will take time to build up those supply chains and build up that manufacturing capacity, as well as to train a workforce that's able to do this. So, in the interim, I think we will have to rely on supply chains, and I think about that are abroad, and I think about it as how do we build in some redundancy so we have multiple supply chains, both onshore, nearshore, but also further away.
On behalf of the RWA, I really want to thank you for your time today and the opportunity to interview on Coffee Chat. Do you have any last words before you have to leave?
Sure. The last minute I have, look, I think the Sacramento region is poised to really go through this remarkable growth spurt, especially if you look at my district, as Elk Grove, Rancho Cordova, Folsom start to open up in the eastern part of the county. As we're doing that, though, we've got to make sure we're thinking about the infrastructure we need, not just today, but also the infrastructure that is going to serve us for the next decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. And so, I think that'll be our challenge. Again, my job as the member of Congress is to go out there and advocate for those funds to help us build that infrastructure that's going to really serve us well for the next few decades. So I think our future looks bright. I appreciate the opportunity to have a few moments here to answer some questions. And again, thank you all for the work that you do. I think we're blessed with water districts that work closely together.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for your continued support. You've been a real champion for water and the water districts and the customers and the residents of this region. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Be safe.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and participation in the RWA Coffee Chat. that's it for today. But I appreciate you joining us. And in the future, we will have additional coffee chat sessions on different topics. But that's all we have for today. And thank you for participating.